Was the FBI sidelined during the first 48? Hey, everybody, Matt Johnson, host of Justice with Matt Johnson. Thanks for being with me. We have big news in the search for Nancy Guthrie. Well, the FBI Director Kash Patel recently went on the Sean Hannity podcast and dropped a bombshell, not just one, but two, saying that the FBI was sidelined not for 48 hours, but 4 days when they were boots on the ground. He also claims that they had a fixed wing aircraft ready to transport the DNA evidence to Quantico, but instead the sheriff decided to send it to a private lab that they were contracted with. So we have reaction there. Also, this sheriff releasing a blistering statement in response to Kash Patel's statements on the podcast. We're going to break that down with an insider, someone that can actually speak police talk. We have a retired homicide detective on the show here to help break down all of those statements and also answer the question, what's next in the case? And was this suspect working alone? But first, do me a favor. Hit the like, hit the subscribe, share this episode with a friend. Let's bring the true crime family back together. Now, the case of missing Nancy Guthrie. Here to help break it all down, we have a friend of the program, Chris McDonough, retired homicide detective, works with the Cold Case Foundation. They do a lot of good work, and the host of the hit true crime YouTube channel, The Interview Room. I'm going to have details in my show notes. Hit the subscribe there. First off, thanks for being here. And when we're talking Nancy Guthrie, there hasn't been a whole lot lately, and now we're finding out that there's a lot of infighting between the FBI and the sheriffs.
Yeah, isn't that interesting, Matt? And thank you so much again for inviting me on your program. I kind of predicted this. I don't want to say that I knew this was what was happening behind the scene, but it was pretty obvious based on how the FBI had not been, engaged right away. And so I kind of figured there was, some discussion about this. In fact, I did an episode on it towards the very beginning, within a week or so of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance.
Yeah, and I want to play for you part of the interview that kind of really ruffled a lot of feathers within the sheriff's department, because then there was a response that was issued. I'm going to play the first part of this interview. It was on the Sean Hannity podcast, and get your response to it.
In the Nancy Guthrie case, I got frustrated because I knew from my sources they were trying to keep you guys out.
They did.
They did keep you out.
And look, here's how
time matters in an investigation.
The first 48 hours of anyone's disappearance are the most critical. And here's how these cases works. It is a state matter. It's a state and local law enforcement matter. What we, the FBI, do is say, hey, we're here to help. What do you need? What can we do? And for 4 days, we were kept out of the investigation. And when we were finally let in, Sean, look what we did. We went in and got the Ring doorbell. And we said, hey, is anyone talking to Google? I called the leadership at Google and I said, look, we know that there was not a subscription service to capture all of the data that would have been captured had there been a subscription service. But can we go into the cache? Can we go into the data before it's deleted and see what we can find? That's why you have that image, because the FBI worked with Google to put that image out. Another thing we asked to do.
You guys got that tape, which was the biggest breakthrough during that case.
We could have gotten it days before. We could have also maybe gotten more data.
Okay, so, clearly he's taking credit right away with the images that we got something like 12 days into this investigation. And you know what? Kudos to them. Whether or not that could have been done sooner, that's a big question mark. But what else did you hear with this? He's making a big claim saying that they were kept out from working on this investigation within the first 48, and that's critical, right?
Absolutely, 100%. And, behind the scenes, here's the real nuances of what he's not saying, but what is probably occurring. Okay? First of all, there was a lack of experience, on the ground right away in this case. I mean, we now learn that some of the investigators that have been assigned to this case, were new to, the homicide unit, et cetera, like that. Okay. That's number one. Okay? That is never a good thing in a high profile kidnapping and or high profile event like this. So the second thing that's occurring here is is history between the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department. I mean, they had just come off of an investigation where one of their officers or a deputy had, been under the microscope, for lack of a better term. The third piece of this nuance is the fact that this is a state situation, meaning what I mean by that is if it was a homicide, and that's after they went from, a missing person search, et cetera, they immediately shifted into the criminal investigation, then that is a state-controlled circumstance, i.e., if they find the body, then that is going to go to the state court, not to the federal court. So what the sheriff did was he pushed back. And what I mean by that is he basically closed the door and said, thank you for being here, but we do not need your assistance. We're going to do it our way. Okay? And if we do need you, we'll give you a call. Well, I think rapidly he realized that he was losing control of this investigation. What I mean by that is they were not making the progress that they could have made. And that is only due to the experience level of all those parties involved at the time. You have a supervisor that was assigned over the homicide team that had never, ever worked a homicide case. Okay? And now you thrust him into the largest, investigative kidnapping since the Lindbergh baby. Okay? Well, that means there's going to be a lot of decisions that are not being made within those first 48, which Kash Patel was talking about there. They had the evidence response team. They had the FBI, within a phone call away. I'm sure they did show up within the first 24 hours, but they were told, you stand over here. How do we know that? The very first press conference that the sheriff came out with, there's nobody behind him from the FBI. It's his guy that has never, ever worked a homicide standing behind him. Okay. Well, after that press conference, they realized this isn't going well. And next thing you know it, you have 2 FBI agents at the next press conference. So if you look at that sequence, that's basically what Kash Patel is saying. We were available, but they didn't want to let us through the door. Okay. Why that happens, sometimes, the reality behind the scenes is not as pristine as people would want it to be.
Well, they came out with a huge statement, very lengthy statement, and we're going to break it down. And it addresses the 2 major points that was made on this podcast by Kash Patel. And here's the first part to it, addressing that first clip that we played. It says, Sheriff Nanos responded to the scene the night of the incident, providing immediate local leadership and oversight. A member of the FBI task force was also notified and present at the scene, working alongside our personnel. The FBI was promptly notified by both our department and the Guthrie family. While the FBI director was not on scene, coordination with the Bureau began without delay. So what is actually being said there? What is not being said?
Well, this is still the political. This is a political statement. What this is, okay? It's not in the best interest of Nancy Guthrie. This is tit for tat, is what's going on here. I mean, let's talk about who the FBI task force is. The FBI task force is an organization of individual officers from various agencies all over the Tucson, Phoenix area. Okay? It is run by the FBI, and he could have a member from the Pima County Sheriff's Department, one of his officers, who is on that task force. So that could be the guy, a member of the FBI task force. It could be his own deputy. Okay? So that tells me nothing. Okay. What we have to look for is the nuances initially when this thing went down. Who released the photographs of the guy on the porch? Was it the sheriff's department or was it the FBI? It was the FBI. And that was a tit for tat against the sheriff. Okay. Kash Patel himself put these photographs online, not the sheriff. Okay. And that was a pushback to, well, if you would have let us in earlier, we could have had a lot more information. And now we're hearing it from him. Okay? But I said this almost, 8 weeks ago, that there's a lot going on behind the scenes. And one of the things I was hoping for is that the public would not be drugged into the middle of this, argument going on, because there was a lot of precious time and a lot of precious potential evidence lost on behalf of Nancy Guthrie. And this is just wrong. It's wrong.
Yeah, you did say that. You said it here before, and you said it many, many times, that you were hoping that your spidey senses weren't true. And now it's coming to fruition, right? Well, it's actually coming to light that they were not getting along, and that this has become a tit for tat. And it's clear with these statements that are going back and forth that they are not getting along. And it's hurting the case, and it's hurting the cause of finding this 84-year-old woman. The other thing that was mentioned in this interview, it was a lengthy interview, but there was only 2 questions for Nancy Guthrie on the Sean Hannity show. Here's the other one.
Send the DNA to a lab in Florida, not Quantico.
That's the other thing that you hit on, right? Again, we were saying we'll process it. I launched hundreds of agents and intel staff to Phoenix and Tucson just for this case, just to be on standby.
And they didn't want
just
you
to
there.
do the canvassing. And we said, we'll take the DNA. And again, it's a state and local matter. So it's their call on where to send the DNA. We have Quantico, best lab in the world. I had a fixed wing aircraft on the ground ready to move it immediately through the night.
Did they just say no?
And they said, we're sending it to Florida. And then, I don't know,
They have
60 days. They have jurisdiction, so it's their call. So
Bad call.
well, that's for the American public to decide. And what we can do is continue to offer support. We would have analyzed it within days and maybe gotten better information or more information. Our lab's just better than any other private lab out there. And we didn't get a chance to do that. So
Okay, let's go in reverse there, because I've talked to DNA experts, and I know you have too. A lot of times the private labs are the better labs. We've seen that with the Golden State Killer. We've also seen that with Rex Heuermann's situation, Long Island serial killer who recently confessed to those crimes. So it was no surprise that another lab would get involved. Whether or not the Florida lab is going to be the best lab for the hair that doesn't have the root, that's another question. That's another episode. But, what was your response to that statement? We're going to pick apart his statement. But what was your response to that line?
Well, I agree with you on the lab that, the sheriff's department's probably been using that lab for other situations. They had a rapid DNA. Remember, the sheriff came up initially that says, look, we have a rapid DNA machine, but it's down. So we had to go to Phoenix. And what that machine does is within 4 hours, it gives you an initial, profile that you can match up almost, instantaneously and throw it into a direction like CODIS or something to that effect, or match it to something else that you might have. And that just gives you the initial, hey, this is the type of person that you may be wanting to, chase here for a moment. So that in of itself was the first step that they took. The second step after that was they took that sample that had run through probably the rapid DNA sample, and they shipped it off to their lab in Florida, which is an accredited lab, which you're talking about, which is kind of maybe a routine situation that they use in homicide cases. That is not, unusual at all. A lot of times you have to get in line at Quantico, and that could take 5 or 6 months. But what I hear Kash Patel saying is, look, this is a situation that we also felt was important enough. They had the power because it's a state jurisdiction. However, we were standing by to put it on a plane and ship it back to Quantico and immediately dive into it. And again, it's those nuances of, I'm saying this, he's saying that. The sheriff is putting statements out. Kash Patel's putting statements out. The bottom line here, quite frankly, is the public expects much more professionalism. And quite frankly, I do too. I mean, it's almost embarrassing, being in the law enforcement profession. I've been in this game since 1982, and I've never, ever seen anything like this.
Would there really be a plane standing by? I mean, in the middle of the night, like I'm envisioning a pilot with an FBI badge and his sole purpose is going to be flying this DNA. I mean, really?
Customs and Border Patrol. They have an airport right there in Tucson. And we used to fly with those guys all over the country to go interview witnesses in cases. So yes, what he's saying is true. You literally pick up the phone and you say, "Look, I need an aircraft at this time. Have your guy standing by, and a customs officer will be sitting there." It might not necessarily just be an FBI plane. A lot of times, you lean on the Department of Homeland Security. They have all kinds of assets. And so I believe what he's saying is true.
And this is why the true crime community loves you and your show so much, is because you can decode the BS and get rid of that for us. I want to play part of it again, and then I'm going to ask you another question about the search part.
They send the DNA to a lab in Florida, not Quantico.
That's the other thing that you hit on, right? Again, we were saying we'll process it. I launched hundreds of agents and intel staff to Phoenix and Tucson just for this case, just to be on standby.
And they didn't want
just
you
to
there.
do the canvassing. And we said,
okay. Was there hundreds of agents there on standby? Was there a canvas? I don't remember a proper canvas and grid search according to the CSIs that I've interviewed.
So what I hear there is when this thing went down, that first phone call went in from the FBI, from the probably the special agent in charge, right? The SAC. Okay. Hey, we see what's going on. We have all kinds of resources. What do you need? Okay. That phone call probably first went through, the task force, that task force officer. Okay. The commander of that task force called them up and said, "We have A, B, C, and D. How many guys do you need? How can we help?" Okay. The sheriff's department at that point makes a decision. That call may have come from the sheriff himself, a captain, and or a lieutenant. Okay. Somebody said, "We're good. Put it on hold right now." Okay. Almost immediately thereafter, what do we see happening in this investigation? We see a bunch of guys taking down a Range Rover with FBI gang task force on their shirts, in the printing on the back of their shirts. That's who Kash Patel's talking about.
Well, this second part of the interview that was on Sean Hannity, again, there was that long response from the sheriff. Here's what it looked like. It was posted on all their social media. It was very dramatic, again, tit for tat. And then here is what was said, just to break it down, about the collection of evidence. Decisions regarding the evidence processing were made on scene based on operational needs. The laboratory utilized by the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI laboratory in Quantico have worked in close partnership from the onset and continue to collaborate in the analysis. That's true. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. What do you get from it?
That's crafted by a really good public information officer. And saying, you know what, that's a great question. We'll get back with you with the answer.
I've been told that so many times in my career.
And as a homicide guy, the last thing you want to say is, "Look, we screwed up." Okay, because at some point the defense attorney is going to ask you, "Did you screw up?" And you have to say yes or you have to say no, and you have to be honest about it. The reality of this, when they do capture the perpetrators in this thing, the defense is going to have a field day.
When are we going to catch these guys? I know I ask you that a lot on and off camera, but and we're still waiting on those other photos to be released.
Matt, I think it comes down to, again, the minutia details in this investigation. You have to go back to the first interviews that were ever done. You have to go back to all the initial canvassing that was ever done. And if we think about this guy here on the porch, right? He's not really the most sophisticated individual, because if in fact he had come into this environment, multiple times in pre-surveillance, et cetera, then that means he brought a car into this environment. And I've said from the very beginning, a car will solve this case. The reason for that, it's much easier, again, to find a vehicle than it is to find a body in that vehicle or a body somewhere in the desert. Okay? Most people, if they're going to use a car to take a victim out of a particular area, okay, then once they leave this area and they felt comfortable, maybe coming and going, avoiding cameras, but once they leave this area, they're going to hit an entire other camera system that they did not anticipate, but law enforcement has access to it. Okay? And that's called a flock system, F-L-O-C-K. Okay? That system is all over Tucson. And so if you came through that system multiple times to come to surveil Miss Nancy Guthrie's house, they're going to find you. Okay? And lo and behold, what do you start seeing? You start seeing cars getting impounded. You start seeing, the Range Rover, for an example. Why did they just pull that Range Rover by arbitrarily, pulling that guy over? Okay, why'd they get the initial DoorDash guy? Okay, they weren't looking for that guy. They were looking for the car. Okay, and what did they do? And what else has the investigation moved towards? They've asked the public. They went back, months and months at these dates and these times. Do you have any video with inside this bubble here? So let's think of it in a couple of rings, okay? The interior ring where Miss Guthrie is and the exterior ring. So they may have information of a car coming through the exterior ring, and they're trying to see can we put that exterior interior? Okay. Can we see if that car went into the neighborhood where Miss Guthrie lives? Okay. So now at this point, they're going to be looking for cars that have been tore up, maybe torched, maybe sold, et cetera, maybe painted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's where the FBI is an incredible resource, because at that point you can say, I need 50 agents to hit every body shop within a geographic region in the Tucson area. Guess what? That is a phone call away, okay? Evident of the fact, what did we start seeing initially at the gun stores, okay? They showed up with a list of people saying, hey, did any of these people buy a gun here, okay? That's not by accident. That is not by accident. That's the investigation moving, okay? And the sheriff's department do not have those resources. And that, I think, is another piece of the puzzle that Kash Patel was saying. Look, we have those 100 guys. He didn't mention it, but he didn't tell everybody that. And by the way, in one day, we hit every gun store in the Tucson area. Okay, one day. Okay, and this is the same thing with the car. That's probably happening behind the scenes. We just don't know about it.
Yeah, you and I talked about the car cracking the case before, if anyone wants to watch that episode. It's fascinating. And also we had talked about at the time, your thoughts as to whether or not this guy was armed and whether or not he was working alone. Do you still have the same thoughts? Has that changed at all?
Yes, I still have the same thoughts. I think there's at least one other individual involved here. And one other piece that I recently discovered is I talked to an astronomer who was able to place, when this guy first comes through that archway there, you see his shadow on the concrete, okay, as he's walking, the video, where he's walking towards the front porch. Well, the moon is positioned at a certain longitude, latitude that would have created that shadow because it was a full moon that night. And this individual told me they were able to narrow it down to approximately 0200 a.m. or 2 o'clock in the morning. Okay. And so those are the kind of things also that you can do behind the scenes and figure out, okay, even though we may not have, metadata on this video, because remember the sheriff was saying, we don't know what time this was going on. Well, then you have to think out of the box and get more creative. Okay. And so this astronomer was able to say, look, based on the position of this shadow and based on the position of the moon that night, that tells us that that shadow would have been cast around 2:00 in the morning. And now you may have at least a time frame that you can work, which makes a lot more sense now when you push that forward towards when Miss Guthrie's watch disconnected from her pacemaker. Was it before or after this? Okay. Which, those are the kind of details, the minutia details, that shadow. Who would have thought, well, let's look at the shadow and find out what time where the moon was positioned, that potentially could have figured out when that time frame was.
That's genius. I love that. And don't hold us in suspense. Of course, everyone's going to go check out the interview room episode on that. But what was the general answer? Did it change the timeline at all?
No, it was right in sequence. It was right in sequence. Yeah.
I didn't know where you were going with this when you first said an astronomer. I was like, are you going to predict the sign of the person who abducted Nancy?
Being in San Diego County, we had Scripps Oceanography, we had the Jonas Salk, the UCSD. So we had a lot of these scientists that we would, pick up the phone and say, hey, Doc, I got a guy that, let's say went off the pier. What are the tide, situations that's, Scripps Oceanography? Where do you think this body would potentially show up? And I'll tell you, these guys are really amazing. They are really good. And so that was kind of the concept also with, the people that study the stars and you have a shadow, where would the moon be positioned?
That's fantastic. When you were talking about the press conference, I don't think that we've seen a joint press conference with the Guthrie family, and maybe the infighting, which is what we're really talking about in this episode, is part of that.
Yeah, it could be, and that's what a sad commentary, right? That we're having to talk about, that Savannah and the family are sitting off into the sidelines, right? And we know there's been a lot of moving parts in this thing behind the scenes. Some of it pushed back for, bad feelings. I put money on it that's what's happening. And now we're seeing another piece of that puzzle, come out into the public arena. They are the focus. This is the clarity of focus for Miss Nancy Guthrie. This is the clarity. And, having, worked hundreds of homicides in my time, you have to keep them first and foremost. You got to set the ego aside, and you just have to go to work. I guarantee you, the folks on the ground, the officers and the deputies and the FBI agents on the ground, they don't care what the administration is doing. They could care less. Okay? They just want to go and get the bad guy and maybe recover Miss Guthrie. That's their clarity of focus. The politicians, which the sheriff is an elected official, they can do whatever they need to do. But the folks on the ground are wanting to get it done. And I have full confidence that they will get it done.
The other thing that I wanted to ask you about before I let you go is there's been also a lot of, people talking about, why has the case gone cold, even though there is so much money being offered to either rat someone out or to do the tip themselves or have a change in conscience, whatever it is, right? You don't think that this person was acting alone. We've talked about that. Do you think that this person is deceased?
No.
Do you think that the perpetrator that is at this door is alive?
Yes. Because I also think he's local. I don't think he's going to be far from the environment because he is so comfortable. If we just think about going back to that car principle real fast, the fact that he comes into this environment multiple times with a potential vehicle, that tells us he's not concerned about the neighbors seeing him or anything to that effect. Okay? This guy is just, he blends into the environment like a chameleon because he's kind of there. He's going to be that guy. Okay. And when we think about the authorities running to the nearby gas station and trying to pull, the tape, for maybe the suspect had gone there, that again tells us, right, this guy is right near this environment. He's not far away, whoever this person is. Okay. And I still subscribe to the theory that Dr. Mercado has, that it's a chef and a couple of waiters, maybe one waiter, maybe two, we're not sure. But somebody behind the curtain is much smarter than that guy on the porch. That guy was the worker bee. Okay? And you may have a second worker bee that night sitting in a car somewhere, the walkie-talkie, pull the car up, or they positioned the car on the side of the garage, and then they changed the plan and said, no, we're coming out through the front, move around. Okay? Or that's all just fake.
Well, hopefully we get answers soon. And even though it's not a great reason to have this case back in the headlines, hopefully they're working better together and the family that you were talking about gets the answers that they deserve and that they need. Retired homicide detective, Cold Case Foundation, host of the hit podcast and YouTube channel, The Interview Room, Chris McDonough, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks, Matt. You're awesome.
Anyone with any information in the case, please call the tip line, 1-800-CALL-FBI. You can remain anonymous. Meanwhile, let's keep our thoughts and prayers with Savannah and her entire family as we search for answers and justice for Nancy. That's the very latest. Take care of yourself. We'll see you next time.